I really believe that if Jesus was physically on the earth today, he wouldn't be riding a donkey. Think about that for a minute. He'd be in an airplane preaching the gospel all over the world.
Faith it's not mental ecstasy. Oh, Lord, my faith brought me this. No, it is moral energy.
Most people remember Jesse Duplantis for one thing, a private jet. But what if that wasn't the controversy that should concern his ministry the most? Over the past few years, criticism has expanded far beyond luxury lifestyles. New legal scrutiny, renewed debates over prosperity theology, questions about financial transparency, and even growing skepticism from within Christian circles have all added another layer to the story. None of these developments alone tells the full picture, but when you place them together, they raise a much bigger question. Why are things suddenly looking so uncertain for one of America's most recognizable televangelists? And once you start connecting the pieces, the picture becomes much harder to ignore. If there is one issue that has followed Jesse Duplantis more than any other, it is money. Not because he is the only pastor to raise funds, but because the scale of some of those appeals has continued to spark debate long after they were first made. Over time, what began as isolated criticism has grown into a broader discussion about financial transparency, ministry leadership, and the expectations people now have of public religious figures. The most well-known example came when Duplantis announced that his ministry needed a new private jet, explaining that faster travel would help spread the gospel around the world. He later clarified that he was not simply asking people to buy him an airplane, but inviting supporters to believe with the ministry for the aircraft. He also pointed out that previous ministry planes had been donated to other ministries, rather than kept for personal use. For many supporters, that explanation aligned with a long-held belief that ministry tools should match the size of a global mission. If businesses and governments use modern transportation to reach people efficiently, they argue, ministries should not be expected to operate differently. Critics, however, remained unconvinced. They questioned whether such expensive assets reflected wise stewardship, especially when many faithful supporters faced financial struggles of their own. The controversy quickly spread beyond Christian media, becoming a national conversation about the relationship between faith and wealth. The questions did not stop with the aircraft. Watchdog organizations and critics continued asking how ministry funds were managed, how financial decisions were made, and whether greater transparency would strengthen public trust. Supporters responded that the ministry's work speaks for itself. Critics argued that visible results do not remove the need for accountability. And as those financial questions continued to grow, many people began looking beyond the donations themselves to the lifestyle those donations appeared to support. As questions about fundraising continued, attention gradually shifted to something even more visible: how Jesse Duplantis lives. For many observers, the discussion was no longer just about money coming into the ministry. It became about whether the public image of the ministry matched the message being preached. Over the years, reports highlighting Duplantis' multi-million-dollar home, private aircraft, and luxury vehicles have circulated widely. Supporters often see these as evidence of God's provision and the success of a ministry that has reached people across the world. They argue that prosperity itself is not a sign of wrongdoing, and that Scripture contains examples of faithful people who possessed great wealth. Critics see the same images differently. They argue that such displays make it difficult to reconcile the ministry's message with the biblical emphasis on humility and stewardship. To them, the concern is less about wealth itself and more about perception. When expensive lifestyles appear alongside repeated fundraising campaigns, questions naturally follow about priorities and accountability. Those questions resurfaced after Hurricane Ida struck Louisiana in 2021. Some critics wondered whether ministries with significant resources were doing enough to help communities devastated by the storm. Jesse Duplantis Ministries responded by saying it provided relief efforts, including generators valued at around $100,000, and emphasized its commitment to assisting affected families. For supporters, that demonstrated the ministry's willingness to serve during a crisis. Critics acknowledged the assistance but argued that expectations for high-profile ministries are naturally greater because of their public resources and influence. The debate was no longer simply about one home or one airplane. It had become a larger conversation about what people expect spiritual leaders to represent in an age where every public decision is examined. And those expectations inevitably lead to an even deeper question. What teachings shaped this view of faith, wealth, and success in the first place? By this point, the conversation is no longer just about airplanes, homes, or fundraising. Those issues all lead back to one central idea, the theology that has shaped Jesse Duplantis for decades. To understand why the controversies continue, many observers believe you first have to understand the message behind them. At the center of Duplantis' teaching is the prosperity gospel, the belief that God desires his people to experience blessing in every area of life, including their finances, health, and daily needs. Supporters say this message encourages people to trust God completely, give generously, and expect him to provide. They point to testimonies from followers who believe their lives improved after embracing these teachings, seeing prosperity as evidence of God's faithfulness rather than personal ambition. Critics, however, argue that the same message can create difficult expectations. They believe it risks connecting financial success too closely with spiritual maturity, making wealth appear like proof of God's approval. Some theologians also question whether it gives enough attention to biblical themes such as sacrifice, suffering, and contentment. As prosperity teaching has become more widely debated, Jesse Duplantis has found himself at the center of those conversations. One example that reignited criticism came in 2021 when Duplantis suggested that believers' generosity could help fulfill the mission of the church and, in that sense, contribute to preparing the way for Christ's return. Supporters interpreted the comments as an encouragement to support worldwide evangelism. Critics argued the remarks could leave the impression that financial giving was directly connected to accelerating prophetic events, a claim they believed stretched beyond biblical teaching. Whether viewed as inspiration or misinterpretation, the debate reached far beyond Jesse Duplantis himself. It became part of a larger discussion about the prosperity movement as a whole, and that discussion soon moved from churches into the national spotlight. Because once the media became involved, the story stopped belonging only to his supporters and critics. It became a conversation the entire public could watch unfold. As criticism surrounding Jesse Duplantis continued to grow, it reached a point where the conversation was no longer happening only inside churches. It became national news. What had once been debated among supporters and critics of prosperity theology was now being discussed by mainstream media, online commentators, and millions of people who had never watched one of his sermons. The turning point for many was the private jet controversy. News organizations across the country covered his request for a new aircraft, while clips of his explanation spread rapidly on social media. One statement in particular received enormous attention when Duplantis suggested that Jesus, if physically on Earth today, would use modern transportation to reach people around the world. Supporters understood the comment as an illustration about using today's tools for ministry. Critics viewed it as another example of luxury being justified through ministry. The attention didn't stop with traditional news outlets. YouTube channels, podcasts, and social media creators began revisiting older controversies, introducing them to audiences who may never have heard of Jesse Duplantis before. Memes, short video clips, and reaction videos turned him into one of the most recognizable faces associated with the prosperity gospel debate. Whether fair or unfair, the internet often reduced years of ministry to a handful of viral moments. At the same time, organizations that advocate for greater financial transparency in religious ministries renewed calls for clearer reporting and stronger accountability. While supporters argued that critics were unfairly targeting successful ministries, others believe public trust is strengthened when ministries voluntarily provide greater openness about finances and governance. Perhaps even more significant, some respected evangelical and charismatic leaders publicly questioned whether highly visible displays of wealth were helping or hurting the witness of the church. The debate had moved beyond the secular media. It was now taking place within Christianity itself. And when questions begin coming from both outside and inside the church, the people most affected are often the ones sitting in the congregation. As the public debate intensified, the real question became whether it was changing the people closest to Jesse Duplantis' ministry. Headlines may shape public opinion, but the long-term health of any ministry depends on the trust of its supporters, and that is where the effects of years of controversy become more difficult to measure. Many longtime followers have remained firmly committed. They continue to believe Duplantis is faithfully preaching a message of hope, generosity, and God's provision. To them, the criticism is nothing new. They see it as a pattern repeated throughout history, where successful ministries often become targets of misunderstanding and public attack. From that perspective, standing by the ministry is viewed as an act of faith rather than loyalty to one individual. At the same time, not everyone has responded the same way. Some former supporters have publicly questioned whether the ministry's emphasis on prosperity still reflects the values they believe the church should represent. Others have expressed concern that repeated controversies have made it harder to invite friends or family to engage with the ministry, fearing that public perception now overshadows its message. The shift appears especially noticeable among younger Christians. Surveys in broader church trends suggest many younger believers place greater importance on financial transparency, servant leadership, and accountability than previous generations. While these expectations are not directed at Jesse Duplantis alone, they have become part of the wider conversations surrounding ministries associated with prosperity teaching. Even so, the ministry continues to attract supporters through television broadcasts, conferences, books, and international outreach. Its influence has not disappeared. The real question is whether it can continue growing while facing a level of public scrutiny that seems to increase with each passing year. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest question of all. Not what Jesse Duplantis has faced in the past, but what those challenges could mean for the future of his ministry. Looking ahead, the biggest challenge facing Jesse Duplantis may not be a single controversy. It may be the growing expectation that public ministries operate with greater openness than ever before. In an age where financial records, news reports, and social media discussions can spread around the world in minutes, reputation has become one of a ministry's most valuable assets. And once questions about that reputation begin to accumulate, rebuilding confidence can take far longer than losing it. One issue that brought renewed attention arrived in 2024 when Jesse Duplantis was named in an amended civil securities fraud complaint connected to the promotion of INDX Coin, a cryptocurrency project. The lawsuit alleges that several religious figures helped promote the investment to Christian audiences. It is important to note that these are civil allegations, not findings of liability, and Jesse Duplantis Ministries declined public comment at the time. Even so, the development added another headline to an already long list of public controversies, keeping his ministry in the spotlight for reasons beyond its preaching. For supporters, the answer remains simple. They believe decades of ministry work, global outreach, and transformed lives speak louder than criticism. They argue that no large public ministry can avoid controversy, especially one that challenges traditional expectations. Critics see a different pattern. They argue that each new issue, from fundraising debates to questions about prosperity theology, public image, and now legal scrutiny, adds another layer of uncertainty. Individually, none may define the ministry. Together, however, they create a perception that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Whether that perception changes will depend on more than public statements. It may depend on how the ministry responds to a culture that increasingly values transparency, accountability, and measurable trust. And perhaps that's why the biggest question is no longer about Jesse Duplantis alone, but about what his story says about the future of modern televangelism itself. When people hear the name Jesse Duplantis today, opinions often form almost immediately. For some, he remains a preacher who has spent decades encouraging people to trust God without limits. For others, he has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the prosperity gospel and the questions that now surround it. Somewhere between those two views lies a much bigger story. Perhaps the most important lesson isn't whether every criticism is fair or whether every defense is convincing. It's that expectations placed on public ministries have changed. Today's audiences don't simply listen to sermons. They examine financial decisions, compare public lifestyles with biblical teachings, follow legal developments, and expect greater transparency than previous generations ever demanded. That shift reaches far beyond one ministry. Across the Christian world, leaders are facing increasing questions about stewardship, accountability, and how success should be measured. Is influence defined by larger audiences, expanding ministries, and visible prosperity? Or is it measured by simplicity, openness, and public trust? Those are questions that churches, ministries, and believers continue to wrestle with, and there are no easy answers. For Jesse Duplantis, the future may ultimately depend on whether his ministry can navigate this changing landscape while holding on to the message that built it. His supporters believe it can. His critics remain doubtful. The debate is far from over. But perhaps the most surprising part of this story is that it was never really just about one televangelist. It may be about an entire movement standing at a crossroads. Because if the standards for faith, leadership, and accountability are changing, then Jesse Duplantis may not be the last well-known preacher forced to answer these questions. He may simply be the first of many.